I sat stunned in the lawyer's office as my entire world collapsed. The family attorney explained that my recently hospitalized parents had transferred all assets to my brother Scott. Despite sacrificing my career to care for them during their illnesses, I had been completely cut out. The lawyer awkwardly slid documents, showing my continued financial obligations without any inheritance rights. Before I could process this betrayal, my phone buzzed with a message from Scott. Guess who's in charge now? Growing up, I always felt blessed to have parents who supported me through everything. Mom and Dad were the kind of parents who never missed a baseball game or school play. When other kids complained about their families, I honestly couldn't relate. Sure, we had our disagreements, but the foundation was always solid. My brother Scott was 4 years older, and while we weren't extremely close, we got along well enough during our childhood years. After college, I pursued my dream career in architecture. I worked my way up at a prestigious firm in Chicago, far from our family home in Pennsylvania. Scott chose a different path, moving to California to work in tech sales. We both visited home for holidays and special occasions, maintaining what I thought were equally close relationships with our parents. Everything changed 3 years ago. I was 32 when I got the call that changed the trajectory of my life. Dad had suffered a major heart attack, and during the stress of the situation, Mom started showing concerning symptoms that were later diagnosed as early-onset dementia. Their health crisis hit suddenly and severely. Scott flew in for the initial emergency, stayed for 4 days, then returned to his life in California with vague promises to help however he could from a distance. I still remember watching him wheel his suitcase out the door, while Mom asked for the 3rd time that day when he was arriving. The decision I made next wasn't really a decision at all. It was simply what needed to be done. I took a leave of absence from my firm, packed up my apartment in Chicago, and moved back into my childhood bedroom. What I initially thought might be a few months of caregiving turned into years. Each day became a carefully orchestrated routine. Mornings started with medication management, followed by Dad's cardiac exercises and Mom's cognitive activities. I scheduled and attended every doctor appointment, managed their increasingly complicated finances, and handled the everyday tasks they could no longer manage. Nights were punctuated by Mom's confusion and Dad's breathing difficulties. My career went from on hold to nearly abandoned. I took occasional remote consulting jobs when I could, but my parents' needs always came first. Meanwhile, Scott called maybe once a month, usually speaking to our parents for less than 10 minutes, before citing some urgent work matter. As the months passed, both Mom and Dad stabilized into a fragile but manageable condition. Dad could handle short walks around the neighborhood, and Mom had good days where her old personality shone through the fog of dementia. During one of these clear moments, about 6 months ago, she took my hand and said something that kept me going through the hardest days. "Brandt, sweetheart, your father and I know what you've given up for us. We've updated our will to make sure you're taken care of. The house will be yours, along with enough to restart your life when the time comes." I was touched but tried to brush it off. "Mom, I'm not doing this for an inheritance. We know that," she said with surprising clarity. "That's exactly why you deserve it." With that assurance, I began making tentative plans to restart my career while maintaining part-time caregiving. I reached out to my old firm about remote possibilities and even lined up interviews with local architectural offices. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful about my future. Then came the call from Thomas Wilson, our family attorney for over 20 years. "Brandt, I need to see you in my office tomorrow. It's regarding your parents' estate planning. It's rather urgent." His tone sent a chill through me, but I never imagined what was coming. When I arrived at his wood-paneled office the next morning, Thomas couldn't quite meet my eyes. He shuffled papers unnecessarily and cleared his throat several times before speaking. "Brandt, I've called you here because there have been significant changes to your parents' estate plan. Changes that directly affect you." I nodded, assuming they'd finalized the arrangements Mom had mentioned. 2 weeks ago, your parents came in with your brother Scott and executed new documents, a complete restructuring of their trust and will. He slid a folder across his desk. Scott has been named executor, sole beneficiary, and has been granted power of attorney for both healthcare and financial decisions. I stared at him, certain I'd misunderstood. What are you saying exactly? Thomas sighed deeply. I'm saying that as it stands now, upon your parents' passing, all assets will transfer to Scott. The family home, investments, insurance policies, everything. Additionally, Scott now has legal authority to make all decisions regarding their care and finances while they're living. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. That can't be right. There must be some mistake. I'm afraid not. The documents are legally executed. I did express some surprise at the change, given your caretaking role. But your parents insisted this was their wish. As I flipped through the papers with trembling hands, Thomas continued. There's one more thing you should know. Your name remains on several household accounts and credit lines as an authorized payer. You're still financially obligated for those expenses, despite the change in inheritance. That's when my phone buzzed. The text from Scott made my blood run cold. Guess who's in charge now? I drove home from the lawyer's office in a daze, nearly missing the turn onto our street. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for several minutes, trying to compose myself before facing my parents. Inside, I found them in their usual spots. Dad in his recliner watching the History Channel. Mom at the kitchen table with her word puzzles. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet nothing was. How could they have done this without even telling me? How was your meeting with Thomas? Mom asked, her voice casual as if we were discussing the weather. I pulled out a chair across from her. Why didn't you tell me about the changes to your will? Dad muted the television and called from the living room. What changes? The confusion in his voice seemed genuine, which only added to my own. Mom looked down at her puzzle, suddenly very focused on finding a 6-letter word for betrayal. The documents you signed 2 weeks ago, I said. Giving everything to Scott. Making him power of attorney. Oh, that. Mom waved dismissively. Scott explained it was for financial security. Tax purposes. It doesn't change anything day to day. It changes everything, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. You told me the house would be mine, that I'd be taken care of after everything I've done. Dad shuffled into the kitchen, leaning heavily on his walker. What's all this about the house? Nobody's taking the house. I looked between them, noticing how Mom wouldn't meet my eyes, while Dad seemed genuinely confused. You signed papers giving Scott control of everything, I explained. The house, your accounts, even decisions about your medical care. That doesn't sound right, Dad muttered, his brow furrowed. Marion, did we sign something like that? Mom's hand trembled slightly as she set down her pencil. It's complicated, Harold. Scott said it would protect our assets. You remember, he brought that nice notary lady to the house when Brandt was at his therapy session. This was the first I'd heard of Scott visiting while I was out, let alone bringing a notary. I normally scheduled my monthly therapy appointments during my parents' afternoon naps, when they were least likely to need anything. Scott was here. When? He's been visiting every few weeks, Mom said. He said he didn't want to bother you, so he comes when you're out. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Scott, who could barely be bothered to call, had been making secret visits behind my back. I excused myself and went upstairs to my room, needing space to think. Later that evening, as I was helping Mom prepare for bed, she had one of her moments of clarity that sometimes came in the evening. Brandt, she whispered, gripping my arm with surprising strength. I think we made a mistake with those papers. Scott said you wanted it this way, that you were tired of taking care of us and wanted to go back to Chicago. My heart sank. Mom, that's not true. I never said that. Her eyes clouded with confusion. But he showed us texts from you. Said you were only staying for the inheritance. Before I could respond, the fog returned to her eyes. Did you feed the cat? We need to feed Jasper. We hadn't had a cat named Jasper since I was in high school. The next morning, I waited until my parents were settled with their breakfast before beginning my investigation. First, I called Scott, who predictably didn't answer. Then I checked my parents' medication logs. I'd been meticulously tracking their medications since becoming their caregiver, noting any changes in dosage or timing. What I found disturbed me deeply. During the weeks leading up to the signing of the new documents, there were several irregularities. Dad's heart medication and Mom's dementia drugs had been administered at unusual times, with higher than prescribed doses on certain days, particularly the days Scott had apparently visited. Next, I searched the house for any additional documents. In Dad's home office, now rarely used due to his condition, I found a stack of mail that had been redirected from our regular spot. Bank statements showed large withdrawals I couldn't account for. A letter from their primary care physician referenced an appointment I hadn't scheduled or attended. My search eventually led me to a hidden folder in Mom's craft room, tucked beneath her knitting supplies. Inside were financial statements for accounts I didn't recognize, and printouts of text messages, supposedly from me, but that I'd never sent. The most alarming discovery came when I checked the home computer's browsing history. Someone had researched signs of caretaker abuse and how to remove a family member from a will. There were also searches for local nursing homes with the lowest costs. My phone rang, startling me. It was Thomas Wilson. Brandt, there's something else you should know. I've been reviewing the documents more carefully, and I noticed Scott has already exercised the financial power of attorney. There have been significant transfers from your parents' retirement accounts, and it appears he's taken out a second mortgage on the family home. The pieces were starting to fit together. I remembered Scott's gambling problem during his college years, something our parents had bailed him out of more than once. A quick social media search confirmed my suspicions. While he portrayed a successful life in California, his recent posts hinted at financial troubles, comments about betting it all, and needing a big win. A deeper dive into his work situation revealed he'd been fired from his tech sales job 6 months ago. The timing aligned perfectly with his renewed interest in our parents' well-being. Just as I was processing these revelations, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. Got your parents to sign everything over just in time. Should have seen it coming, little brother. Too late now. Better start packing. The next morning, I contacted every elder law attorney in a 50-mile radius. Most couldn't see me for weeks, but one agreed to a brief consultation that afternoon. Jessica Barnes specialized in cases of elder financial abuse, and her office walls were covered with thank you cards from families she'd helped. Based on what you've described, she said after reviewing the documents I'd brought, the power of attorney and will changes appear legally binding on their face. However, if your parents were over-medicated or coerced, or if they didn't understand what they were signing, we could potentially challenge them. How do we prove that? I asked. That's the difficult part, Jessica admitted. We would need evidence of your brother's manipulation, medical records showing your parents were impaired at the time of signing, or testimony from the notary. And if we can't get that? Her expression softened. Then legally, your brother has control of your parents' assets and medical decisions. I left her office with a heaviness in my chest and a list of next steps that seemed dauntingly long. When I arrived home, Scott's rental car was in the driveway. I found him sitting at the kitchen table with our parents, looking perfectly at ease. Mom was making his favorite lunch, a tuna melt sandwich. She hadn't made for me once in the 3 years I'd been caring for them. There he is, Scott announced with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The dedicated caretaker returns. Scott. I acknowledged stiffly. This is a surprise. Just checking in on Mom and Dad, making sure everything's running smoothly with their finances. Dad looked confused. What finances? Is something wrong with our money? Everything's fine, Dad. Scott assured him. Remember we talked about this? I'm helping manage things now. I bit my tongue, knowing a confrontation in front of our parents wouldn't help matters. Scott, can I speak with you privately? He followed me to the backyard with a smug confidence that made my skin crawl. What the hell are you doing? I demanded once we were alone. You manipulated them into signing those documents. Scott leaned against the old oak tree we used to climb as kids. Manipulated? That's a strong word. I simply helped them make better arrangements for their future. By stealing their retirement? Taking out a second mortgage? He didn't even bother denying it. They're my assets to manage now, legally. They were heavily medicated. They didn't know what they were signing. Scott's smile widened. Prove it. By the time you could get a case through the courts, I'll have liquidated everything worth taking. Face it, Brandt. You played the dutiful son for nothing. This isn't about money, I said. It's about their care. Right, he laughed. Saint Brandt, always so selfless. Well, I've got plans for them. There's a place in Ohio very affordable. Shared rooms, minimal staff. Should stretch their remaining assets for a few years at least. The casual cruelty in his voice shocked me. You're planning to move them to a nursing home? Of course. The house will sell for a nice profit once they're out. I'm thinking of listing it next month. That's their home. Dad can barely handle going to the doctor's office without getting disoriented. A move could kill him. Scott shrugged. People adapt. Or they don't. Either way, it's happening. As he walked back inside, I remained frozen in place, trying to process the extent of his betrayal. This wasn't just about inheritance. He was planning to uproot our vulnerable parents and stick them in the cheapest facility he could find, all to line his own pockets. Over the next few days, I discovered more disturbing details. The automatic payments I'd set up for household bills had been redirected to come from my personal savings account, rather than our parents' trust. Scott had changed the billing information without telling me, leaving me to cover expenses that should have been paid from their funds. When I checked my credit report, I found several new inquiries from lenders I'd never contacted. Someone had been using my information to apply for loans. In the stack of mail that arrived that week was a credit card statement for an account I'd never opened, with thousands of dollars in charges at casinos and luxury hotels. While organizing Dad's medication, I noticed several of his prescription bottles were nearly empty, despite being filled only a week earlier. The same was true for Mom's memory drugs. When I asked them about it, neither could remember taking more than their prescribed doses. The most painful discovery came when I found a box in the garage labeled Brandt's things. Inside were family heirlooms, my grandfather's pocket watch, my grandmother's pearl earrings for my future wife, photo albums from my childhood. Items my parents had always promised would come to me. A receipt at the bottom of the box showed Scott had already sold several pieces to a local pawn shop. That night, I received another text from Scott. Found more things to sell. Amazing what people pay for sentimental junk. I was sitting at the kitchen table, head in my hands, when I noticed a stack of financial documents Dad had apparently been reviewing before his condition worsened. Among them was a loan agreement for $45,000 with my signature on it, money I'd never seen or borrowed. The signature looked convincingly like mine, but I knew I'd never signed it. Scott hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He'd stolen my identity. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the next 2 weeks. Scott took an extended vacation from his non-existent job in California and moved into the guest room. Immediately, he began restricting my access to our parents. They need consistency, he argued when I tried to maintain their usual schedule. Your methods aren't working. Look how confused Mom is. Of course she was confused. Scott had rearranged her entire routine and changed her medication schedule. Dad, too, seemed more lethargic than usual, sleeping through most of the day and struggling with basic tasks he'd previously managed. When I tried to administer their evening medications, Scott intercepted me. I'll handle that now, he said, taking the pill organizer from my hands. You're always getting the doses wrong. I've been managing their medications for 3 years without any problems, I protested. Well, "There's a new system now," he replied. "Doctor's orders." When I called their physician to confirm these supposed new orders, the receptionist informed me that Scott had removed me as an authorized contact. I no longer had legal access to their medical information. The next blow came when I tried to take Mom to her weekly pottery class at the senior center, an activity that always brightened her mood. "They're not going to activities anymore," Scott announced. Too stimulating. Too confusing. Within days, our parents, who had been stable and occasionally even happy, began showing signs of serious decline. Mom stopped getting dressed, remaining in her nightgown all day. Dad developed a persistent cough that Scott dismissed as just allergies. When I suggested calling the doctor, Scott exploded. "Stop undermining me. They're my responsibility now. If you can't accept that, maybe you should move out." Desperate, I contacted Adult Protective Services to report suspected elder abuse. They promised to investigate, but when the social worker arrived for the home visit, Scott had clearly prepared. The house was spotless. Our parents were well-dressed and seemed relatively lucid, and Scott presented himself as the concerned son who had stepped in to provide better care than his unstable younger brother. After the social worker left, Scott cornered me in the hallway. "Nice try," he hissed. "Pull something like that again, and I'll have you removed from the property. Don't forget whose house this is now." Friends and neighbors who had been supportive of my caregiving efforts began to distance themselves. I later learned Scott had been spreading rumors that I was suffering from caregiver burnout and having psychological problems. He suggested I might even be stealing from our parents, a rich accusation coming from him. The final straw came when I discovered Scott had emptied the special medical fund our parents had established for future care needs. The account that had held over $100,000 now showed a balance of less than $500. The withdrawal had been made the same day Scott purchased a new BMW, which he now parked ostentatiously in the driveway. That evening, I confronted him directly. "You stole their medical fund money to buy a car? They need that money for their care." Scott, slightly drunk on our father's expensive scotch, laughed. "They're not going to need it for much longer anyway." The casual cruelty of his statement shocked me into silence. "Oh, come on," he continued, emboldened by my reaction. "We both know Dad's heart is getting worse, and Mom barely recognizes us half the time. The money would just go to some nursing home. At least this way someone enjoys it." "You're talking about our parents," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "The people who raised us, who bailed you out every time you gambled yourself into debt. How can you do this to them?" Something dark flashed across Scott's face. "They didn't do me any favors. Always comparing me to you, the perfect son. Well, look who's winning now. This isn't a competition, Scott. It's their lives." He drained his glass. "Should have thought of that before you tried to cut me out." "What are you talking about? I never tried to cut you out of anything." Scott's expression shifted, and I realized he was drunker than I'd thought. "Don't play innocent. I saw the original will. Everything to precious Brandt for his selfless care. Nothing for Scott except a token amount. Typical. So you decided to take everything? To forge my signature on loans? To drug our parents so they'd sign whatever you put in front of them?" As soon as the words left my mouth, I knew I'd made a tactical error. Scott's eyes widened, then narrowed dangerously. "You can't prove anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I think I can," I bluffed, hoping to learn more. Scott slammed his glass down. "They signed those papers willingly. Sure, maybe they were a little extra medicated that day. Maybe I scheduled the notary for right after they'd taken their strongest doses. But nobody forced their hands. And there it was, the admission I needed." Scott had deliberately timed the document signing to coincide with when our parents would be most impaired and suggestible. I maintained a neutral expression, not wanting him to realize what he'd just revealed. "You'll never get away with this," I said quietly. "Already have," he smirked, his momentary concern evaporating. "Everything's legal. Everything's signed. And in another month, they'll be in that facility in Ohio, and I'll be enjoying my new life with my inheritance a little earlier than expected. As he staggered off to bed, I sat in the darkened kitchen, the full weight of the situation crushing down on me. Scott wasn't just stealing their money. He was actively endangering their health, possibly shortening their lives through neglect and overmedication. I had to do something. And now, finally, I knew where to start. First thing the next morning, I drove to an electronics store in the next town over and purchased a small digital voice recorder. If Scott was willing to make incriminating statements while drunk, I needed to be ready to capture them. I also bought a new prepaid phone that Scott wouldn't recognize or have access to. My next stop was Jessica Barnes's office. I hadn't scheduled an appointment, but her secretary took pity on me and squeezed me in between clients. He admitted to deliberately overmedicated them for the signing, I told her, keeping my voice low despite the privacy of her office. And he's forged my signature on multiple loans. Jessica's expression grew serious. That changes things. Intentional overmedication could invalidate the documents, and forgery is a criminal offense. But it's my word against his, I pointed out. For now, she agreed. But if we can gather evidence, we have options. I'd recommend starting with a forensic financial investigation. She provided me with a detailed action plan. First, document everything Scott said or did that suggested financial exploitation or medical neglect. Second, obtain copies of all financial records I could legally access. Third, separate my finances completely from the family accounts to protect myself from further identity theft. On my way home, I stopped at the bank where I had a solo account my parents didn't know about. I withdrew enough cash to sustain me for several months if things got ugly, storing it in a safety deposit box Scott couldn't access. Back at home, I began discreetly documenting the changes in our parents' conditions, taking dated photographs of their declining health and keeping detailed notes about medication irregularities. I installed a small camera in the living room, disguised as a clock radio, positioned to capture Scott's interactions with our parents. My most important discovery came when I was paying bills and realized I was still listed as the authorized payer on many household accounts, including utilities, cable, internet, property taxes, and insurances. While Scott had gained legal control of our parents' assets, he hadn't bothered with the mundane details of maintaining the household. This oversight would prove to be his undoing. I created a spreadsheet of all accounts, their payment sources, and due dates. Then I began the painstaking process of contacting each creditor to explain the situation. I couldn't cancel services our parents needed, but I could ensure I wouldn't be financially responsible for them going forward. I'm calling about account number 7283449. I told the power company representative. I need to remove myself as an authorized payer while maintaining service to the residents. We can do that, sir. We'll need verification of your identity and a forwarding address for any final bills in your name. One by one, I separated myself from the financial obligations Scott thought I would continue to shoulder. For accounts that required written documentation, I used a P.O. box I'd rented rather than our home address to prevent Scott from intercepting the mail. During this time, I maintained a facade of defeated acceptance around Scott. I stopped challenging his decisions openly, making him believe I'd given up. This false sense of security led him to become increasingly careless. One evening, while he thought I was at the grocery store, I recorded him on the phone with a gambling buddy, openly discussing his plans to cash out our parents' remaining assets before dumping them in the cheapest facility that would take them. He laughingly described how he'd forged my signature on loan documents and used my credit to fund his gambling. The most disturbing discovery came when I noticed our parents' prescription bottles emptying faster than their dosages should allow. I initially suspected Scott was increasing their medications to keep them docile and confused. The truth was even worse. I installed a second hidden camera, this one facing the medicine cabinet in our parents' bathroom. The footage revealed Scott regularly pocketing several pills from each prescription bottle. A quick internet search confirmed my suspicions the medications my parents depended on had street value. Scott was stealing their essential medications to sell. This explained their rapidly declining health. Dad's increased heart problems weren't just stress. They were symptoms of inconsistent medication. Mom's greater confusion and agitation resulted from withdrawal when her dementia drugs weren't administered properly. With this evidence in hand, I returned to Jessica Barnes. She reviewed the recordings, photographs, and financial documentation I'd gathered. "This is exactly what we needed," she said. "We have grounds for emergency intervention now. Your brother has committed multiple crimes: identity theft, forgery, elder abuse, and prescription drug diversion." "What's our next move?" I asked. "First, we file for an emergency revocation of the power of attorney. Then we contact law enforcement about the financial crimes and drug diversion." "Will that be enough to protect my parents?" Jessica's expression softened. "It's a start. But ultimately, we need to present this evidence to your parents when they're lucid and help them understand what's happening. They need to choose to revoke the legal documents themselves." As I left her office, I knew the confrontation ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had a plan, I had evidence, and most importantly, I had the truth on my side. It was time to take back control and protect my parents from the son who had betrayed them. My plan began with the financial infrastructure Scott had overlooked. On a Monday morning, when I knew he'd be out meeting his drug contacts, I sat down at my computer and systematically canceled every automatic transfer from my accounts to the household expenses. Mortgage, utilities, credit cards, all of it. Next, I contacted the 3 major credit bureaus to place a freeze on my credit, preventing Scott from opening any new accounts in my name. I filed formal fraud alerts on the accounts he'd already compromised, disputing the charges and loans he'd created with my forged signature. The credit card company was particularly responsive once I explained the situation. "We'll need a police report number for the identity theft," the fraud department representative explained. "I'll have that for you today," I promised. My next stop was the local police station, where I filed formal reports for identity theft, forgery, and elder abuse. Detective Sandra Morgan, in the Financial Crimes Unit, reviewed the evidence I'd gathered. "This is unusually well documented," she noted, examining the spreadsheets and recordings. "Most family financial exploitation cases are much harder to prove. I've been gathering evidence for weeks," I explained. "My brother thinks I've given up." "That works in our favor," she said. "We'll need to move carefully to protect your parents. These cases can get complicated when the victims have cognitive impairments." I left with case numbers for 3 separate investigations and a temporary protective order that would prevent Scott from removing our parents from the home or accessing certain financial accounts while the investigation proceeded. While the legal wheels began turning, I implemented the next phase of my plan. I contacted my parents' doctors, using the documentation Jessica had prepared to regain access to their medical information. The neurologist who managed Mom's dementia care was especially concerned about the medication irregularities I reported. "If her medications aren't being administered consistently, it could cause permanent setbacks," Dr. Patterson explained. "We need to get her back on a stable regimen immediately." He scheduled emergency appointments for both parents, which I arranged to attend without Scott's knowledge. The medical evaluations confirmed my fears their conditions had deteriorated significantly due to improper medication management. Both doctors documented their findings, adding crucial medical evidence to our case. With the protective groundwork laid, it was time for the most difficult part, confronting our parents with the truth about Scott's betrayal. I chose a morning when Scott had mentioned he'd be out for several hours, meeting with a business associate, likely his drug buyer. I prepared the living room carefully, ensuring both parents would be comfortable and as lucid as possible. I administered their correct medications at the proper times the night before and that morning. I made Dad's favorite breakfast and played the classical music that sometimes helped clear Mom's mental fog. As they sat together on the sofa, more alert than they'd been in weeks, I knelt in front of them. "Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you about something important," I began gently. It's about Scott and some changes he's convinced you to make. Dad frowned. What changes? Patiently, I explained about the altered will, the power of attorney, and the financial exploitation. I showed them bank statements documenting the withdrawn funds and photographs of their medications that had been tampered with. But Scott said you wanted to leave, Mom said, confusion clouding her eyes. He showed us messages from you. Those messages were fake, Mom. I never said those things. I've been here taking care of you, while Scott has been stealing from you. Dad shook his head, struggling to process the information. That can't be right. Scott's our son. So am I said softly. And I would never hurt you the way he has. I played one of the recordings I'd made short enough not to overwhelm them, but clear enough to hear Scott's own words about dumping them in a facility and taking their money. Mom began to cry, while Dad's face flushed with anger. I don't understand, Mom whispered. Why would he do this? He's in financial trouble, I explained. He lost his job months ago and has gambling debts. He saw your assets as a way to solve his problems. We were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Scott had returned earlier than expected. He walked into the living room and froze when he saw us all together, the financial documents spread out on the coffee table. What's going on here? He demanded. Dad struggled to his feet, more steady and determined than I'd seen him in months. We know what you've done, Scott. Taking our money, lying about Brandt. Scott's face hardened. Don't listen to him. Brandt's been manipulating you both for years. He's the one who's been stealing. We've seen the evidence, Mom said, her voice trembling, but resolute. The bank statements, the recordings. Recordings? Scott's eyes darted to me. You've been spying on me? I've been protecting our parents, I replied calmly. Something you should have been helping with, not exploiting. Scott lunged toward the coffee table, trying to grab the documents, but I stepped between him and our parents. He shoved me hard, sending me stumbling backward. This is my house now, he shouted. My money. I earned it, after putting up with being the second favorite son my entire life. His rage seemed to clear the last of the fog from our parents' minds. Mom stood up, steadier than she'd been in weeks. This will always be our house, Scott, she said firmly. And we're changing everything back today. Scott's face contorted with fury. You can't do that. The documents are legal. It's too late. Not according to our attorneys, I said. Elder abuse and coercion invalidate everything you've done. Scott took a threatening step toward me, fists clenched. You think you're so smart. I should have dealt with you months ago. I wouldn't, I cautioned, nodding toward the clock radio on the shelf. Everything you're saying and doing is being recorded right now. Detective Morgan, at the Financial Crimes Unit, is very interested in adding witness intimidation to the list of charges. The mention of police involvement caused Scott to pale visibly. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape route. This isn't over, he snarled, backing toward the door. You'll regret this. After he stormed out, Mom collapsed into tears, while Dad called Thomas Wilson to arrange an emergency meeting to revoke Scott's power of attorney. I held Mom's hand, assuring her everything would be okay. We were so confused, she said between sobs. He told us you wanted to leave us, that you resented taking care of us. I never resented it, I said truthfully. You're my parents. I love you. 2 hours later, as we sat in Thomas Wilson's office signing the revocation documents, Scott was being interviewed by Detective Morgan about the financial fraud and prescription drug diversion. The protective order prevented him from returning to the house or contacting our parents. That evening, as I helped Mom into bed, she squeezed my hand. We almost lost everything because we couldn't see what was happening. Can you forgive us? There's nothing to forgive, I assured her. Scott took advantage of your condition. But it's over now. We're going to make things right. What I didn't tell her was that Scott's damage would take months, if not years, to fully repair. The financial devastation was extensive, and their health had suffered setbacks that might never completely heal. But for the first time since that fateful meeting in Thomas Wilson's office, I felt like we had a fighting chance. As I turned out Mom's light, my new phone buzzed with a text from Jessica Barnes. Temporary conservatorship granted. You now have legal protection to manage their care and recover assets. Scott's access completely blocked. The first battle was won. Now the real work of healing could begin. The weeks following Scott's exposure were both challenging and healing. With the temporary conservatorship in place, I had legal authority to manage our parents' affairs and begin undoing the damage Scott had caused. Our first priority was stabilizing their health. With proper medication management resumed, both showed remarkable improvement. Dad's heart condition stabilized, and Mom began having more good days than bad. Their doctors expressed cautious optimism about their prognoses. Your quick intervention likely prevented permanent damage, Dr. Patterson told me during a follow-up appointment, particularly for your mother. Inconsistent medication in dementia patients can cause irreversible decline. Financially, the situation was more complicated. Scott had depleted many of their accounts and taken out loans against their assets. The forensic accountant Jessica recommended discovered he had gambled away most of the money, though some had gone to luxury purchases we could potentially recover. 3 weeks after Scott's departure, the financial consequences of my strategic moves began to manifest. The mortgage payment, which should have been automatically withdrawn from our parents' account, bounced due to insufficient funds. Scott had emptied the account, but hadn't made alternative arrangements for the household expenses he now legally controlled. I received a concerned call from Thomas Wilson. Brandt, the mortgage company, contacted me. The payment was returned for insufficient funds. There are other bills coming due as well. I'm aware, I replied calmly. I've been monitoring everything. This could become serious quickly. The second mortgage Scott took out has an acceleration clause. If they miss payments, the entire amount could come due. Let's see how Scott handles it, I said. He wanted control. Now he has the responsibility that comes with it. Sure enough, that evening my prepaid phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Listen, Brandt. Scott's voice was tense. There's some issue with the mortgage payment. I know you canceled the automatic payments. This isn't hurting me. It's hurting Mom and Dad. Their credit will be ruined. I didn't return his call. The next day, another call. The utility company says they're going to shut off service next week. You need to fix this. I know what you're doing. Again, I didn't respond. 3 days later, Scott's tone had changed completely. Look, I'll make the mortgage payment, okay? Just stop whatever you're doing with the accounts. I can't access anything. I allowed myself a small smile. The walls were closing in on him exactly as planned. During this time, I worked closely with Jessica to document all of Scott's financial abuses for the ongoing criminal investigation. The district attorney had taken a special interest in the case, particularly the prescription drug diversion aspect, which had escalated it from a family financial dispute to a much more serious criminal matter. Scott made increasingly desperate attempts to access our parents' remaining assets, unaware that they had been legally frozen pending the investigation. His own accounts were depleted from gambling losses, and the creditors he owed were becoming impatient. 1 month after Scott's exposure, Mom received a text message that she immediately forwarded to me. Mortgage is due. Second notice. Need $8,000 immediately, or we lose the house. With Jessica's approval, Mom sent a simple reply. Ask Scott. He's in charge of the money now. Hours later, my phone buzzed with a message from Mom. Scott says he can't pay it. Wants to know if you will. With Jessica and Detective Morgan's guidance, I crafted Mom's response. Not my responsibility anymore. Scott wanted control of everything. The desperation in Scott's messages increased as other bills came due. The second mortgage he'd fraudulently obtained. The credit card accounts he'd maxed out. The luxury car payments he couldn't make all were collapsing around him simultaneously. Finally, the message we'd been waiting for arrived. Mom forwarded it with her hands shaking. "Mom, please." The mortgage company called. "They're starting foreclosure proceedings. I need help. Tell Brandt the mortgage is due." Mom looked at me uncertainly. Should I answer him? I nodded, showing her the prepared response we'd discussed with Jessica. Those two words triggered an avalanche. Within hours, Scott appeared at the house, pounding on the door, ignoring the protective order. The security cameras I'd installed captured his tirade on the front porch. "I know you're in there," he shouted. "You can't do this. I'll lose everything." The police arrived within minutes, alerted by our security system. Scott was arrested for violating the protective order, adding another charge to the growing list against him. 2 days later, Jessica called with news. The judge has made the conservatorship permanent and completely revoked Scott's power of attorney. Your parents' new will has been accepted and filed with the court. "And the financial recovery?" I asked. "It's complicated, but promising. The forensic accountants have traced most of the missing funds. The second mortgage will be invalidated due to fraud. The identity theft claims you filed are progressing, so your credit should be restored. The BMW has been seized as evidence of financial exploitation." The legal consequences for Scott mounted quickly. With the evidence I'd gathered, the district attorney charged him with multiple felonies: elder abuse, identity theft, fraud, forgery, and prescription drug diversion. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of significant prison time, Scott accepted a plea deal. The terms were strict: full restitution of all stolen funds, 5 years of probation, mandatory gambling addiction treatment, and most importantly, no contact with our parents or access to their finances ever again. The felony convictions ensured he could never again hold power of attorney or fiduciary responsibility for anyone. 6 months after that fateful day in Thomas Wilson's office, our family began to heal. The house was secure, with the fraudulent second mortgage invalidated. Our parents' health had stabilized, and with consistent care, they were doing better than anyone had expected. I had resumed my architecture career on a part-time basis, working remotely for my old firm in Chicago while maintaining my caregiving responsibilities. The arrangement allowed me to use my professional skills while still being present for my parents. One sunny afternoon, as we sat on the back porch watching birds at the feeder, Dad brought up something unexpected. "We need to talk about the future," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "About the will." I shook my head. "That's all taken care of, Dad. You don't need to worry about it." "No, I need to say this," he insisted. "Your mother and I have been talking. What happened with Scott, that wasn't just about money. It was about recognizing who truly cares for us." Mom reached over and took my hand. "We want to be clear this time. The house will be yours. The trust will be set up properly, with safeguards Jessica recommended. I'm not doing this for an inheritance," I said, echoing my words from months earlier. Dad smiled. "We know. That's exactly why you deserve it." 2 weeks later, I received an unexpected email from my former supervisor at the Chicago firm. They had a major new project near our hometown and wanted me to lead it. The position would allow me to work primarily from home, with occasional site visits just minutes away. "This is perfect," Mom said when I shared the news. "You can have your career and still be nearby." The project was a community center focused on elder services, exactly the kind of meaningful architecture I'd always wanted to pursue. The firm had been impressed with my remote work and saw my caregiving experience as an asset for understanding the unique needs of seniors. On a crisp fall day 1 year after Scott's scheme had been exposed, we gathered in the backyard to celebrate my first major architectural contract. Dad grilled his famous burgers, and Mom had a remarkably good day, remembering details and participating fully in the conversation. "I've been thinking about Scott," Mom said quietly as we cleaned up after the meal. Do you think he'll ever change? I don't know, I answered honestly. The counseling might help with the gambling. But the betrayal that came from somewhere deeper. Dad nodded solemnly. Some lessons come at a terrible cost. He lost a family that would have supported him through anything. If only he'd asked for help instead of trying to take everything. The irony, I said, is that he thought inheritance was about property and money. He never understood that our real inheritance is the values you taught us. Honesty, compassion, putting family first. You understood, Mom said, her eyes clear and present. That's why you're here, and he's not. As the sun set over our family home, the home that would remain a safe haven for my parents for the rest of their days, I reflected on everything we'd been through. The betrayal had been painful, the recovery challenging, but we had emerged stronger and with a deeper appreciation for what truly matters. In the end, I realized that the most valuable inheritance isn't measured in dollars or deeds, but in love, trust, and doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. Scott had grasped at material wealth and lost everything that truly mattered. I had prioritized care and responsibility and gained something much more precious, a sense of peace and purpose that no amount of money could ever provide. As my architecture career flourished alongside my continuing role as a caregiver, I found a balance I never thought possible. The community center project led to others, each focused on creating spaces that honored and supported vulnerable populations. My experiences had shaped not only my personal values, but my professional direction as well. Mom and Dad continued to have good days and bad, as is the nature of their conditions, but they were secure in the knowledge that their care and legacy were in trustworthy hands. The legal protections we'd put in place ensured they would never again be vulnerable to exploitation. And as for Scott, I sometimes wonder if he learned anything from the experience. I hope someday he'll understand that his greatest loss wasn't financial, but the irreplaceable bond of family trust. Perhaps then, he'll begin his own journey toward redemption. Have you ever faced a situation where doing the right thing meant standing up to family? What would you have done in my position? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who might find strength in knowing they're not alone in facing difficult family situations. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you find wisdom in your own family challenges.